Eugene Atget has been a huge influence on photography, although he lived and worked in virtual obscurity for his entire career. There are a number of things that make Atget's work particularly noteworthy. In this image, we have an opportunity to see his interest in showing layers of information. Here we see a tree, but through the tree we're able to see Notre Dame, one of the most iconic buildings in the world. And in the Atget photograph, the tree and Notre Dame are equals. There's no hierarchy in his photography for the most part. And his approach was quite idiosyncratic. There were precursors of his, but nobody really did it quite the way he did. Photography had been around for about 60 years when he began taking pictures in the late 19th century until his death in 1927. His mission was to document Paris in its entirety, and he left behind something in the order of 10,000 negatives and prints, and the catalog of everything that was Paris during his lifetime is staggering. Here's a photograph of Notre Dame taken by Edward Baldus, who we've talked about earlier. This, while Notre Dame was still under construction, there's a spire in the middle that still hasn't been erected. But this is a much more typical image of architecture, something we're much more likely to see than the Atget that we'd seen just a minute ago. There's no tree in the foreground. It's very straightforward. It's not a bad image by any means. In fact, it's actually quite nice. But it lacks the creative spark of the Atget. This is a later image also taken by Baldus after the spire had been completed, and again is a relatively straightforward rendering of it. However, this one has a little bit more going on with it for having the bridge in the foreground. But it's still very direct. It's central in the frame and describes the building for those who couldn't actually see it firsthand. And here it is, the front of it. And in a view that can't be replicated today, none of the buildings in the foreground exist anymore. So it's a reminder perhaps of why photography can be so valuable. This is by Charles Negret, and obviously it's Notre Dame again. And this is what I would refer to as a vignette or a detail. It also includes Henri Lessec, who is a fellow photographer of Negret's, and to give it scale, but also a little bit of whimsy in his top hat. Love the gargoyles and the architectural details, but also Negret is showing us a relationship between the building and the surrounding buildings, part of the landscape of Paris in the background. This is the Pantheon in Paris, taken by William Henry Fox Talbot, who we discussed earlier, one of the inventors of photography. Again, a very direct, straightforward image, but he has certainly done it well, including buildings in the foreground, giving the building a relationship between it and the rest of its surroundings. This is another image by Baldus, and I'm not sure what the exact location is, but again, very straightforward. This is an image by Bisson Frere. a really interesting looking building, and different from most of what we've seen so far, in that they came in very close, cropped off the spires, and there's an immediacy to it, sort of in-your-face image of this building. Baldus was working in the 1850s to the 1870s or thereabouts, and so this is a precursor of Atget, and certainly part of the tradition that Atget came from. We had talked earlier about the various photographers who went abroad and brought back images of exotic places. This is by Felix Bonfils in Egypt. And again, very straightforward documentary with the intention of letting people know what architecture, what ancient architecture actually looked like. This is another Gustave Le Gray, and taken, it looks like in an archway off of a courtyard in a church. And it appears to have been taken on an overcast day, which can be very beneficial if what you're interested in showing are details and shadows. There isn't a lot of contrast in the light that you would get if there were direct sunlight hitting any of the any of what you see here. This is by Henri Lesec, and it's a nice example of a vignette, a detail, one in which I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but where the depth of field, depth of focus is very shallow. So the vase and the flowers in it are in focus, but even though the background is not very far away, it's been thrown out of focus. And what that does is really bring the vase and flowers front and center. The photographer is directing our attention. This is by Beato. And again, with people and animals, partly for scale. This is by Carlo Naya, and it's St. Mark's Square in Venice, nicely framed by one of the archways. And it can be overdone, but the use of this kind of element in the foreground can be very useful. Just don't overdo it, I guess that's what I'm saying. Here's the Eiffel Tower under construction, and even with as little of it built as there is here, it's impossible to confuse it with just about anything else. By Edward Durandel. Again, very straightforward. This is by David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson. It's the Sir Walter Scott Memorial in Edinburgh. And a little more interesting than a lot of what we see, and that does have some foreground. We see the carriages and horses, street lamps, buildings on the right, and we have some sense of how the memorial fits in the landscape, keeping in mind that this is a very early image, and as such the print is relatively primitive and doesn't have a great deal of resolution, but the intent is very clear. Here's a photograph of the Forum in Rome by Roger Fenton. Again, the first war photographer. This is by Francis Frith. We're back in Egypt. And here, not only is he using the archway as a framing device, but because it's a ruin, it's also very much about the arch itself as a freestanding object. Has a great deal of depth. Nice time of day to have shot with it, in that it has raking light on the front, bringing the facade, giving it some contrast so we can see details in it, but darkening the interior of the archway, making a stronger frame for the architecture behind it. Here's another frith taken of older pyramids. This is by Robert McPherson, in the temple in Rome. This is by Thomas Annan, and shows an alleyway. Very nice tones, and I love the fact that the background goes very gray, very pale gray, from the atmosphere. And another example of the same effect of the background receding nicely because of the atmosphere, either from smoke or from fog, just haze. This is by Alfred and John Boole. We've seen Frederick Evans' Sea of Steps before, but again, part of the tradition that led up to Eugene Atget. This is Carlo Ponti. It's of Rome and the Vatican, which is barely visible, but there. And by the way, that's not the sun. It's a spot on the print. This is Charles Marville, who was also a French photographer, worked primarily in Paris, and documented the architecture some 20 to 25 years before Eugene Atget.